Let's take a moment here in visualizing the merit field with Buddha Shakyamuni in the center, with all the lineage masters, led by the 7 patriarchs, if you will, to whom the responsibility of looking after the Dharma and its teachings were entrusted after Buddha passed away. So led by them, think of all the lineage masters, to all of whom we owe a debt of gratitude for keeping the teaching intact, as well as passing it on to the next generation, so that we have the privilege of meeting with the Dharma, as well as receiving unbroken lineage of ordination. Think of where we would be and what would come to our health in our messy samsara existence, with all the conditionings ripe around, if there were to be no Dharma and Dharma teachers and the unbroken lineage existing. Also think of fellow sentient beings surrounding us, all in human forms, yet undergoing their own respective common and uncommon samsaric predicaments. Particularly think of those who are in lower realms of existence as animals, famished spirits, hell beings, some of whom have no such thing as respite from their strong sufferings. Even think of others who may be little fortunate in being born as humans, gods, yet still trapped in the samsaric condition, driven by afflictions and actions induced by them. How this seemingly respite or comfort is just a matter of time. Soon it will be lost, and who knows where would that next situation be. More particularly, being trapped like this with no way seen outside of it, out of it, how this prospect of suffering could continue without end. Even if one has attained arhatship or this bodhisattva arya state and beyond, one may be no more subject to being born into samsaric conditions under the force of afflictions and actions induced by them, but nonetheless they have still more work to do to fulfill their own potential, as well as to fulfill those qualities to be of utmost service to all sentient beings that they aspire to. thinking along those lines, cultivate a sense of affinity, growing into empathy, into compassion, into this special resolve that I must do something to make the most of this opportunity that I have, not just by being born as humans, but be so facilitated with the conducive conditions. Among them, the most significant is having met with the Dharma, having met with authentic teachers, and more importantly, having this interest in the Dharma and the fact that one is connecting with it. These are so precious, so rare to come together. Let this boost one's determination to make the most of this time, particularly in working for the benefit of all sentient beings by pursuing the prospect, the goal of enlightenment. So with these things, with these feelings, attitudes of gratitude going to Buddhas and the lineage masters, and this genuine sense of connection, compassion, growing into bodhicitta, going towards all sentient beings, let's join together in this recitation of the homage, or the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. So, yes. My first ever session of EML, where I get to be facing the audience and speaking. So this is a big topic, and I'm not necessarily following from where Venerable left off, because Venerable gave us a free hand in touching on the topic as we wish, while Venerable would have our own plan in proceeding through the many sessions that she does. So I'll be just jumping here and there, so pardon me. You see me frolicking. That's just because I'm joyful. Yeah, thinking of monastic life, monasticism, and more particularly the individual precepts, vows, and levels of vows and precepts that really come to the aid of sentient beings that need some railings around their road, along their path, so that by holding on to them they can move up and make some advancement on their spiritual awakening. Thinking of that, more particularly in the context of Buddhism, I cannot help but think of the Buddha, of course, and then the seven that I was calling patriarchs. I haven't found any particular English way of calling them. The seven, what do you call them? The seven, okay, for now I'm calling them patriarchs, in whom the responsibility of, in whom the charge of the Dharma was given, passed on, one after the other, after Buddha passed away. So they are called the seven Therapdun. Therapdun means 7 generations, or seven generations through which the baton of Dharma was passed on in a very deliberate, clear, intentional way. I'm filled with a sense of gratitude for they are taking on the responsibility in making sure the Dharma stays intact and it also even flourish. So you must have come across these 7. Okay, yeah. They are Mahakashyapa to begin with. He was the first to take on the charge after Buddha passed away. And then he passed it to Ananda. The third one is Shani Gwejen. I tried to look up for its Sanskrit full word. I couldn't find it. English translation, I didn't even try. So the third one is Shani Gwejen. Nyerbe. The fourth one is Nyerbe. His Sanskrit name I know, Upagupta. Didika. That must be Sanskrit name, Didika. Nakpo. The sixth one is Nakpo. So usually it is translated Sanskrit. It comes as Krishna or Krishna. Yeah, Krishna. But that's a common name in India. And then the last one is Lekdong Chembo. Lekdong Chembo will be, to improvise, Mahabhava Vivek. So these 7. Out of them, the first 2, Mahakashyapa and Ananda, were contemporaries of Buddha. But then, maybe from Shani Gwejen, from the third onward, maybe they may not have seen Buddha. But what is quite striking about this line of patriarch is that, at least in the case of the first 4 or 5, even in the written records, it's mentioned that the previous one would pass it on to the next one, and then mention who they have to pass on to, and that goes on. So in the case of Ananda, after Kashyapa served as in charge, or the main patriarch of the Dharma, who Kashyapa must have been appointed by Buddha himself before he passed away, that it would be him who would take charge. But then from Kashyapa onward, Kashyapa instructed Ananda and told him to take charge after me. Then when he was close to his passing away, he gave the charge to Ananda. And after that he went back to a cave where he passed away. It is even historically known that that cave, after he passed away and had his remains in it, that the caves kind of closed on, and it will remain closed until the coming of the Maitreya Buddha. When it will open, until then the body would not have decomposed. The arhats have that kind of a power of staying long in meditation. So anyway, before he did that, he called on Ananda and passed on the baton to him, saying, "You have to take charge." And then told him that after you pass it on to Shani Gwejen. And then Ananda did the same thing with Shani Gwejen, saying, when it was time for him, and for his passing away, he gave it to Shani Gujen and then told him he should give it to Nyerbe Upagupta. So at least the first four of them, it is, even in the records, it's clear. And I suspect that might have been the trend all through the first 7. Now the question is, what happened after the 7? There's no clear indication of who it was officially passed on to, because we only refer to the 7. There are 7 generations to whom the baton was passed on, so who have been entrusted with the charge of the Dharma. So if it is okay, in English it might be the trustees of the Dharma. Although I'm using it with no clear sense of the word, but I'm not going too way off. So, but then in certain accounts, it says that even after the 7th one, it was passed on eventually to Nagarjuna. Some say the 7th one immediately passed on to Nagarjuna. Some say no, it took several masters in between, and it was then eventually passed on to Nagarjuna. Time-wise, even saying that after the 7th, the 8th was Nagarjuna might not be too off the mark, because it would have been already 7 or 5 generations after Buddha, right? Excluding the first 2. The 7, they were totally new generations after Buddha. So, give and take, they lived 60, 70, 80 years. Easily, it would have reached Nagarjuna's time. In the case of Ananda, it was not easy. You remember the story? Yeah. So, in that same year of Buddha's passing away, Kashyapa lost no time in convening the first council. The first council was quite fresh, in the same year as Buddha passed away. So that's when he convened the first council and made sure that the teachings, which were all passed on orally, were kind of recorded. And the way to do that is to play the tape recorders where it was recorded, except it happened to be human recorders. But then he needed Ananda to do the recitation by heart on discourses, the Buddha discourses, the different discourses that Buddha gave over. And Ananda was not yet Arhat. And Kashyapa knew that the way to do that is to be seemingly little harsh, almost unjust after Buddha had passed away. At least in the eyes of an ordinary person, maybe even to Ananda to a certain extent, but maybe not. They might have internal understanding, but to the outside world, it seemed like he was being unjustly treated after Buddha had passed away, because compared with what kind of privilege that Ananda enjoyed during the time of the Buddha, this is like getting him now when anyone could, seen from an ordinary perspective, but none of that was the case. Anyway, he had to have Ananda finish his Arhatship, graduate as Arhat. He must have his graduation. So he kind of sent him away, and I think according to one story, he was even sent with a server, 7-8 years a young server who was an Arhat already. And Ananda must have been very humiliated. And that must have served as an impetus for him to really put on effort. And which he did, and then soon he became Arhat. And now they could get the complete number of 500 Arhats to be present for the first council, where Ananda was asked to recite all that he remembered from memory on the discourses part. And that would mean, it must have taken days, weeks, months. I think the records are not that clear, except saying council happened, except at least the ones that I have seen. Not that I am so much into history as much, but in the accounts that I read. So finally, when he became Arhat, then he was called on, and then the formal council was called on, and Ananda was made to recite from his heart the teachings on the discourses. Kashyapa himself did the teachings on wisdom, and then Upali, you remember, he was from a very low caste, but he really was exemplary in his Vinaya practices as well as Vinaya scholarship. So he was made to recite Vinaya texts. By the way, so that's how it was kind of organized for the first time ever. I don't know whether they put it into writing or not, but at least it was made known that those were the teachings that were taught and authentically recorded, at least by people who had first-hand experience and witness in those. It is said that, on the sideline, it is said that Ananda lived 120 years. So he had another some 40 years or something of service, even after passing of the Buddha. By the way, Ananda got to be attendant to Buddha when Buddha was, can you guess what age? 50-ish, 55. Yeah, some records come very succinctly by saying that for 20 years Buddha didn't rely on an attendant, and then when it was 20 years after his enlightenment, which would make it some 54, 55. Oh, no. 55, because at 35 he became enlightened. So 55. So compared to that, in Tibetan monasteries we have attendants to young children and then adult ones all through their life. But then you know about the story about how Ananda really didn't easily accepted this post, but he set some 8 conditions. 8 conditions. Yeah, one of them was not to teach when I'm not around. If at all something was taught, it should be repeated to me. It should be acceptable to be repeated to me. That's how he got most of the teachings, but particularly the discourses. He got almost like complete teaching since then. Since he took the attendantship, he should not have missed even the slightest teaching. So there are some stories about what happened when Buddha went to Tushita. Did he teach or not? If so, did he break his promise? No. He came down to Kailash and then taught there, something like that. Okay, so that's just a digression. I'm just going off. I'm going off the tangent. Is it off the tangent? On a tangent. The tangent itself is going offward. Okay, so if you go off the tangent, then you're even going up like that. Okay, now I get it. Okay, so you will allow me to go on a tangent, on several tangents. Yeah, so it's amazing how these masters, and they were themselves very, very exemplary ones. Some of them even got arhatship before even becoming ordained. When there were some conditions by which they could not get ordained because they didn't get permission of their parents, but they were themselves so ripe and so advanced that they became arhat. Some became Yeah, some saw, some we have a calling. We call that Dempa Tongwa. Some saw the truth, which is another way of calling. Some attended the path of seeing, right? Saw the truth directly. Saw the truth directly. Some saw the truth at the time of ordination. So you ordain, you already are Arya. And some became Arhats very soon afterwards. So they were, Arhatship was a very common thing. And that's how we make sense of how Buddha chose to appear in that time, at that period, because that's when he could serve the most. And he was most relevant. So anyway, it's amazing how all of this happened, and it is still intact in our time, some 25,000 years down the road. So, and it doesn't have to be this way, but due to the efforts, dedication, prayers, force of prayer, effort, dedication, and commitment of so many beings, this all happened. So we should reflect on these and come to value this for what they are, what they mean to oneself in practical life, but at the same time, how much it took on part of so many to make this available now. But then, in terms of individual efforts or individual part, merely having Dharma around, teachers around, and the customs around is not enough. One has to become a proper vessel, proper receptacle, to be able to connect with the Dharma and benefit from it in the utmost way. So, from the very beginning, the most ideal kind of a mindset to connect with Dharma and to be part of a monastic life, monastic community, is to the extent possible, have some appreciation of why one is doing this. What situation, condition makes this needed. So, ideally, not that everyone starts out like that, but ideally one has to have some sense of appreciation of what is possible in terms of freedom from the sufferings that one is plunged into. And for that sense of need, one has to also come to acknowledge the mess that one is in, the mess where one is in terms of the enslavement to the afflictions and the actions induced by them. So that's the reason why individual liberation, the vehicle of the individual liberation, is called individual liberation. Is called pratimoksha, in Tibetan soso-tarpa. There are two ways of defining it, soso-tarpa. Soso means individual, tarpa means liberation, so individual liberation. But how we, as per the established translation, but how we parse that term, soso-tarpa. One is tangpo-tarpa. And I want to translate that as the first move to liberation. The first move to liberation is to have your eye on liberation. And that is possible by first seeing what kind of a catawampus situation we are in. Did you hear me say catawampus? How come I didn't get the same reaction I used to get? I'm so spoiled by it. Catawampus has become something different, totally different to me. Okay. So one has to have an appreciation of what catawampus is, this situation, and one's eye to liberation. If one does that, then everything one does within that context becomes a cause to liberation. That's the same with bodhicitta, right? Everything that is touched by bodhicitta then becomes directed one way or the other to enlightenment. Likewise for liberation, this genuine urge, not necessarily full-fledged, well-developed renunciation. I mean, that would be too much to ask for, too much to expect, but some sense of why it is required, or why the situation calls for it. And that kind of eyeing to the liberation is very important, and that's called the first move to liberation. If one wants to get out of samsara, the first move is to take stock of one's situation, which is in line with what Buddha did by teaching four truths, beginning with the suffering, truth of suffering. So one has to recognize suffering for suffering, or the dukkha for dukkha, not dukkha for sukha. Very often people mistake dukkha for sukha and pursue after it and get more dukkha, but consider it as sukha. It's another term for it's sukha in Hindi. May not be the same meaning, same spelling, but the pronounced word, it means the same thing. Sukha means dry. Then one remains dry. So long as one pursue dukkha as sukha, then one remains dry without any quality kind of caught on oneself to ever get out of the mess. So the first move to liberation, tangpo tarpa. Ngebara tarpa. Ngebara tarpa is another connotation for that. Ngebara tarpa means definite path to liberation. The urge is the must. The urge is the must. That's the first and foremost thing. Otherwise, nothing else will come after that will contribute to liberation. But this urge is so important. So it is very important for us, either as actual monastics or those aspiring to becoming monastics, or those aspiring to a monastic way of life. Not necessarily as monastics, but a monastic way of life that they could adapt in their situation. For that, there's this need of first seeing this connection between the suffering, this connection between the catawampus and liberation. And very often, many manage to have at least a glimpse or tinge of it at the time of ordination, but not always everyone is that lucky or that advanced, that grown up, right? Some other things may have driven them to monkhood. Even during the time of Buddha, even his own half-brother, Nanda. We usually call him Chung Gao, young Nanda, younger to Buddha, but he was his half-brother. He was so Buddha was dealing with in his students, his disciples, in accordance with their dispositions and like that. But with Ananda, he dealt with him again in accordance with the situation and the dispositions and the relationship, connection he has. So, without Ananda's full acceptance Buddha made him to take the ordination. So there was no way he could have generated slightest tinge of something being wrong in the Mass. He was rather seeing the Mass to be, whoa, a pleasure grove. I was saying, oh, nothing is wrong here. It's so pleasurable. He was more particularly very lustrous and very into marriage, and not just once, twice, maybe so many times. Who knows what? He might have planned so much ahead. Buddha had all those pictures in his mind, right? But still Buddha said, do this. So he had to, one way or the other, somehow. Buddha must have employed some means by which it just made to him the only option to him. So he carried on like that. And then he was still not tamed. Of course, how would he be, right? The awakening was not from within. So this reason, the awakening has to be from within. And so one has to always come back to cultivating oneself, growing oneself. Not just merely see others growing and then be content with the situation. I mean, that would leave oneself behind, because without the inner calling, no growth can be one's own. So then it is said that Buddha took him to celestial realm and showed him the celestial beings there, and said, if you do good as a monk, you would be next born there, and you would have your choice of mistresses for you. However you like. Wow, these are far better than those in the human realms. So he said, okay. He strove hard for the next few years, like that. Then eventually, even with Buddha working with him, he had to take time in working. It didn't come that quickly, because it had to be in sync with the growth of the person himself or herself. So it is always a two-way street, two-way journey. It's not that you get on the bus and the driver just drives. And then eventually he was shown the hell realm and said, if you don't do well, if you engage in wrongdoing, this is where you go. I would have no power over this. You just have to decide. You decide your destiny. This is where you go. That really got him. He saw suffering firsthand. We don't have to go to that extent to see suffering. I mean, suffering is all abounding around us. Yeah. And then he really strove hard. That's when he generated the spirit of definite release, spirit of renunciation. So his sense of renunciation came much, much later, several years into his monkhood. So he was a monk without a sense of renunciation. It's even questionable whether he had even the actual ordination or not. But the scriptures are very clear on this, what to make of this. He said, no, the moment one would have gone through the motion of receiving the vow, but the moment one generates the pratimoksha sense, the renunciation, from that on it becomes genuine pratimoksha vow. Until then it's a similitude. So, in any way, this is a clear indication that no matter how privileged you may be in terms of being so close and so directly in touch with Buddha, unless and until you grow from within, there is no way any actual transformation, change can happen. And that's quite evident. We don't have to go to that extent of really going into what it involves with others. I mean, it's evident within us also. Unless we make effort, we remain the same person. Same person. year after year and year after year, no change would have taken place. That means no spiritual growth. So one cannot bank on other conditions for spiritual growth. It has to be from within, an inner calling. And that involves several factors. From a Buddhist perspective. Even without that long-term perspective of life after this and many, many lives after, in the prospect of liberation and eventually awakening, even without that kind of a perspective also. In this very life here and now, to really make a difference in how one lives, how one meets the situations, how one relates to situations, the change has to come from within. Unless and until that happens, any kind of a cosmetic change around oneself will not help. There will always be something lacking, there will always be something too much, something too little. One would not have changed at all. There will be something always to complain about and thus be suffering from. But then when we consider the prospect of life after life, and then the possibility of liberation and then eventual awakening, unless and until one makes the inner shift, there is not going to be any transformation, any movement. That's the reason why, among all things, Vinaya practice, among the three trainings, wisdom, training of wisdom, training in concentration, training of Vinaya, the moral conduct. Of these three, the last two, the training of morality and the training of concentration combined together, they are likened as the leg. As the leg or the feet, legs. They are likened as the legs. Wisdom is the eye. You have so good eye, bright eye, shiny eye, and you can see so far. So long as your legs don't work, you don't get even an inch closer. You get stuck there. So that again brings us to the point of how actual serious inner training is important. Because morality practice means doing it, abiding it, following it, making effort in following it. Concentration means getting the mind to concentrate, to get concentrated, nothing else. And that's the only way by which the inner will move. And then if you have a good eye, good wisdom, then you will even know where to move, how best to move, how, integratedly you move. All of those. It will be a facility. But until then, no movement will ever take place. So here we are talking of Vinaya in a formal sense among the three trainings, but basically what it is individual effort. Individual effort in cultivating virtue, individual effort in mitigating negativities. Those actual effort, exertion, will only make the move forward possible. Likewise, in the case of the Eight Noble Truths, eight Noble Paths also, again, it says the same thing. The training about morality, the training about the other trainings, they are like the actual will, actual feet. Whereas wisdom, as important as it is, particularly when it comes to actually confronting ignorance and really dealing a death blow to the ignorance, it's solely being done by the wisdom, but not without wisdom grounded on a stable foundation of morality and concentration. So that relationship, that dynamics has to be very clear in our mind, so that we know here and now, where to put the efforts, and where should our eyes be. We should be eyeing far, but it involves dealing with the situation here and now, and that means getting our concentration, getting our actions right, getting our concentration right, and our morality practice, moment by moment by moment by moment, in what you call as integrated as possible. So we are a bunch of people at different stages, at least in the structured formal sense of what could be possible. Although I cannot say who is where at their individual actual achievement, but roughly speaking, we are an array of different people. So we cannot expect everyone on the same page, on the same stage, same level, but at our own given stage, we should be very clear about where the immediate effort should be, and what one's vision or outlook should be. So usually we speak of the Tagom. Another term for the three trainings is Tagom Jesum, view or the outlook, meditation, conduct. So in terms of so that's another term. Just the same three trainings, another term. It's not that they are different. This is important because this way of calling the three trainings as Tawa, outlook, meditation, conduct, is maybe a Tibetan invention. As far as I know, I may be mistaken, but yeah, I've seen scriptures relate to it like that. But it means the same thing as the three trainings. So, but this way of calling Tawa, Gombacheba, outlook, meditation, and conduct is very telling in terms of the dynamics of the three, in terms of how it should be brought to bear in one's moment-to-moment life. So the outlook, as it suggests, it's like one should eye far, have a clear idea, some sense of where one is going. If one doesn't have any sense of where one is going, one could be going, not getting anywhere. Right. If getting anywhere is important, then one should have a sense of where one is going. But then, merely having that sense of where one is going is not enough. One has to actually make the effort to get there. And that will involve dealing with the nitty-gritty details of here and now. That could involve focusing on things. That could involve navigating one's path, right? And focusing on things and navigating one's path. And those are what the practice of morality and the practice of concentration achieves. But to train in this sense, in this kind of attitude, it is very important to have a very clear sense. I mean, of course, which is not to mean that one has to right away have it, but one has to work towards that if one doesn't have it, or improve it even further. A clear sense of the infallibility of cause and effect, the working of cause and effect. That for anything to happen, it has to have a cause. You may call some things to be accidental, miraculous, whatever, but you should be able to see them in the light of being caused by something. For convenience, we can call something as accidental because we do not know, we didn't plan for it, but not that there wasn't any cause for it. We could call something as miraculous. We have no way of explaining it. It's just beyond our understanding. But that doesn't exclude there being any causes. Nothing happens and without causes. Nothing happens without causes and conditions. So conventionally we can have situations that we call this happened accidentally, by luck, or miraculously, whatever, mysteriously, whatnot. But those have their own, their own contextual meaning, not ruling out causes and conditions at all. So to that extent, one has to be very clear that whatever happens, happens due to causes and conditions. If one has any doubt, like what about this, yes, one has to then deliberate and get one's mind around it, understand it, have one's mind wrap one's head around it. Yeah, you wrap your head around it. And then come to dynamics of causes and conditions with volitional thoughts involved in it. And then again make sense of how that addition brings a shift in the dynamics of how that then generates not just results, but also results in the form of suffering, in the form of joy, happiness, no matter how long-lasting, short-lived they may be, but nonetheless, some of that kind. And there too, one has to be able to see the working of causes and conditions. Very often, people think that, when it comes to internal world, there is no cause and condition. And there's no such thing as this leads to this leads to this leads to this. That looked too structured or too concrete, and that cannot apply to the mind. But I would not rule that out. It's just a matter of how we understand or not. But in terms of mental things also, same law of causality applies there. It may be a little more complex, it may be a little difficult to really tease out at our ordinary level. But in a very gross, apparent way, we can bring in some thought. There were occasions, even in my life, there were occasions when I would feel very tense with someone, and I would catch myself doing that, and then I would just bring a shift in the outlook. Right then and there, I would physically feel the ease. The face lights up, the ease you feel. All it took was just a shift in the outlook. And that can happen. And that's a clear indication of how you bring in mental elements in it. It serves a purpose. It creates a shift. That's very clear. And then over time, if we do that, we'll begin to see the change in our life very clearly. So in that respect, yes, causation, the law of causation is something to work on. More particularly in the context of suffering, joy, happiness, karma, which is a subset of causality, with volitional agents being part of it. And thus, in the resultant conglomeration, there will be these elements of suffering, joy, happiness. And in the causal context, there will be volitional actions, meditation. You call them meditation, premeditation. Premeditated thoughts, intentions, planning, all of those. So that's one very important thing. When we speak of the karma, that includes the prospect beyond this life also. To see results of how something causes something, it's in this very lifetime, it's not that difficult. And people may not see them outside, but the people who engages in these negative actions, they right then and there see them, how the negativities cause the negative results within them in the mind stream, and how it can have a ramification outside for oneself, for others, whatnot. But then karma is beyond that. That the effect of it can even extend beyond this life. And when we think of extending beyond this life, it would be little difficult to think of next life when we are looking from this life and looking at next. It may be a little easier to think of how we began in this life. What kind of a package we bear, how that package happened. Then we will have to look for some cause beyond it. before that. The cause has to be always prior to the result. There cannot be cause and coexisting cause and a result, because the results do not need any coexisting causes. They would have already arisen. So when we speak of cause and effect, it will always have to be sequential. And thus, think of how we began in this life. What kind of a package we are. How babies are their own person. It's not like very often parents now realize. Parents also express this. Oh, they are their own person. I cannot say I made them. They are their own person. I didn't have that much of a say totally on them. Yeah. And they are different beings, totally different in the same family, etc. And then what they undergo, what they befall, what hardships, sufferings befall them. Some even pass away, even in the wombs. Why that's the case? And even if one doesn't, one survives birth, but then what one entails, what one is capable of achieving, all of those. So this complex conditioning has to have a cause. If one were to just point to physical conditions, it will be very difficult to account for them. So anyway, depending on how one feels it, convenient or powerful working with oneself, it would be good to switch back to what would be my next and why am I the way I am? Why different? And why am I the way I am in my mental disposition, in my mental inclination, proclivities, talent, capacity, etc. What, with that given data, with that given status, what did it involve in making a change? All of those have to have causes, and those causes go beyond this life. We usually, when we present in a syllogism way, we say, consider the mind. Consider the mind of a baby just born. When you say, when is the baby born, what stage are you pointing at? It depends on how much people can go and say they have consciousness. That's enough. Now say, where did that consciousness come from? Just a bit beyond it. If that came from beyond, how that came from, like that. So those are ways to think about them. If one has if one faces some challenges in it, but it is very important to confront that, not just hide it under the rug, but rather one has to bring it up and confront it, because that will make a big difference in terms of how far one's vision goes to bring in the spiritual practice. And then to say, I aspire to attain full awakening for all sentient beings. This is the must. There is no way around it. And then another aspect is, yes, the unsatisfactory nature of this life. As humans, even as well facilitated humans, but more particularly think also of what it is like to be animals. Yeah, putting oneself in their shoes, in the shoes of the animals. What kind of shoes do they wear? Yeah, so, and to be living like that day after day. All they do is kill for their own survival, sustenance. They There's no way around that. So that means incurring negativities every step of the day, every step of the time. So think of the suffering nature, and has to have a kind of a deep, from one's depth of one's heart, some sense of a movement, some sense of a movement, some sense of a shake-up. This is being recorded, right? Okay. Otherwise, I have some incidents to share, but it will be too... That's fine. But it's so important to really think about this. One time Geshe Dadul also mentioned, right? We do visualization, but sometimes do take time to visualize as animals and take it very seriously. Oh, the limitations, the constraints, limitations, the constraints the one feels for being not able to speak up, for being not able to raise one's voice, for being looked at as commodity, as something to be killed, and then be infested with so many other predators around. And for the baby deer, all they have as refuge is their mom, and mom could only do so much. That was scary. One night I saw a baby deer and the mom. The baby was just sticking with her. And she also didn't know where the danger lies and where food might be. It was just the whole night, when was the snow was deep. The whole night they just didn't sleep at all. They just, what do you call, looked for even the last leaves. And the baby had no other idea where to go, just rely on the mother. And the mother herself is as vulnerable to anything and limited in what they know. And that's not just one night, the same night again. I don't know. And that's kind of a life where it doesn't involve killing something, at least. But then in the case of others, it's, I've heard His Holiness the Dalai Lama was once visiting in the West and was in a hotel room, might be in a remote place outside the country, outside the city. And he looked around and there was wild deer. Tears rolled down. Right then and there. Didn't need to really think. He must be thinking about them all the time. Tears rolled down. And that indeed is a situation which really, really should invoke a sense of helplessness, at the same time the kind of life that they are doomed to. So we cannot take our situation for granted. Even our situation is not perfect. Even it is rife with so much limitations and sufferings, but then compared to what we could be, what we could have been, and what we could be in the very next lifetime, it's scary. This kind of being scared is a realistic one. You first confront to be then overcome. It's not something that you cultivate and then stay in it. Rather, these are something to be cultivated and eventually then employ them on the path to bring us transformation, so that we eventually have overcome them. So this kind of cultivation and reflection should make us quite busy with our practice, and and would leave hardly any time to have any grudge against others. Whereas we do find some time to be picking at others, to think of others, and somebody did this, somebody did this, somebody did that. Okay, it's like it's a luxury that we could do that. Whereas our actual situation, if we look very carefully, there would be hardly any time to spare for that. That's one thing. Another thing is, in Tibetan, when we call someone is Gelong, Bhikshu, someone is Gesul, novice, someone is Genyen, Anagarika, all of them have Tao Kadambuke, Kewa, virtue. That should be something that we should reflect on also. That virtue is among many kinds of virtues. I don't know, what do you call it? Dentambe Kewa. Dentambe Kewa. Ultimate, for now, let's call it ultimate virtue, which is liberation or emptiness. Usually we speak of it as liberation. So, Gelong means bhikshu, one who is seeking liberation. Gesul is one who is training in the modes, in the ways that lead to liberation. Genyen is one who is seeking to be close to the liberation. So all of them, just from thinking of the term itself, of what one is right now, that should be a reminder for us what our main purpose is. And thus align our conduct, thinking, actions, all with that. And thus every step will be a step bringing us closer to that. And in the meantime, we will also feel much comfortable. Usually when people pursue the Dharma, at least in the Dharma centers I have been to, not necessarily those who are long-term students, but those who just come and visit, mostly they are looking for feel-good experience. They think that meditation is, or Dharma practice, meditation is all feel-good. And that's what they look for, and they get it. Because when you close down on everything else and then just think of it, definitely it will bring some ease there. But that's not getting at the root of the problem. When it's just pursuing yet another object that gives temporary joy, and eventually when it runs out of it, then one would leave it. So that's like keeping the same. So feel good, pursuing the feel good is not the way. But rather knowing what causes the bad feeling, what causes the ill feeling, and work on that. Then feeling good is byproduct of it without having to work on it. Work on it. Yet at the same time, every moment, every effort one puts in dealing with the cause of ill feeling or suffering, that would actually get us to put our finger on the cause of suffering. And likewise making special effort in cultivating the causes of joy and happiness, not just the feel good, not just let the feel good be the main object. Because feel good is like the product, and you just dwell on the product or the result of it, and not work on cause in a real sense, but rather on a very superficial way, almost like dealing with yet another soda, new soda. You keep changing. You just pursue with it with the same pursuit of feeling good, and those are very temporary. Likewise, people approach that with meditation also. If one approaches meditation, even practices just from that perspective, just sitting and doing the recitation, it makes me feel good. You do that only for that purpose, without working on the causes of improving joy and happiness, without working on mitigating the actual causes of suffering. Then this will only go so far and will not be that meaningful. So recalling oneself that I am a bhikshu, that I am a novice, that I am a anagarika, that I am someone in training. One is training for virtue, and that virtue is not just any kind of virtue, but rather the ultimate virtue. We call that ultimate virtue. There are in some texts, Abhidharma Samuchaya, it comes up with some list of 13 gyavas, 13 types of virtues, out of which 5 are the most popular ones, of which one is called naturally virtuous. So mental attitudes like faith, compassion, kindness, those are naturally virtuous. There are some which become virtuous by way of association. There are some called virtuous by way of its being the latency or the imprint of a virtue. But then another one is called ultimate virtue. Ultimate virtue is usually considered either emptiness, which in itself is not a virtue, but it is called ultimate virtue, in that pursuing it, getting it, and employing it would lead to the most advanced state of peace or joy. And likewise, the state of liberation itself, once one attains it, that's like having reached ultimate virtue. So, by itself is not a virtue, it is a permanent thing, it's an unconfounded thing, but it's called ultimate virtue. And what else? Anyway, so that's something one could use as a reminder and bring oneself back on track every once in a while. By the way, just merely having ordained or taken vow, or having made some commitment on a personal level in doing something just once is not enough. We have to remind ourselves again and again and again, and have to make the commitment again and again and again, like we do in the purification. You purified yesterday and now you don't say, I've already purified, there's nothing to be purified. Oh no, you look inside, there can be so many you will find. Even the very fact that we do not see things clearly, it's itself a very clear indication that we have something to work on. The unclarity itself is very clear. We have doubts, we cannot see things clearly. We kind of have a wishy-washy take on something. That needs to be worked on. It cannot be left at that two-pronged level. Then it doesn't get anywhere. It has to be then brought together into a one-pointed one. Only then it can so, right? So, likewise. So those are very great indications that yet we have a lot of work to do, purifications to do. So likewise, one has to kind of commit oneself again and again and again. So I thought that thinking of these connotations of how they are supposed to, what they are meant for, what they are supposed to do, is a clear indication, clear reminder for us to come on track and pursue and conduct ourselves, get our acts together. Get our acts together, get our ducks together. Ducks in line. Okay. And in all of this, the main culprit is the afflictions. And we slip into afflictions. One, not knowing that they are afflictions, not knowing what they do. But that is not an excuse. If one doesn't know, in legal systems there may be some excuses. I didn't know anything about it. Yes, I can prove it. You can get away from something. But not in the karmic legal system, not in the karma system. If one doesn't know, but one has approached it with full involvement, intention, whatnot, that's enough to incur the karma. That's actually what animals incur. But then, even if we know that's not a guarantee that we will keep to it. We fall through it. We fall through our integrity, in our commitment, our dedication. So even knowingly, we fall through. Either by way of the force of afflictions, or by way of our lack of conscientiousness. Conscientiousness. Okay, conscientiousness. Or out of just blatant disregard. Right? So we all know the 4 doors by which we incur downfalls. One is out of ignorance, out of not knowing what is downfall, what is not. So as our monastics, we have to really know what our precepts are. That's very important. Okay, we cannot do that in one day, but over time we have to plan out in kind of pursuing it, and then particularly taking advantage of the Pasada day in reciting the precepts and really knowing them. And then reminding oneself, one at a time, eventually knowing all of them. Knowing, without knowing is not not knowing what incurs negativity is not an excuse for engaging in it and be spared of its results. So is the case with our precepts. But then more seriously, even if we know, we can still fall through by the force of our afflictions. We are so habituated in afflictions that even if we know that's not the way to do whatnot, we can fall through it. So affliction is something to work on. So from these doers of these by identifying these doers through which we could incur breach of the precepts and thus incur negativity. By knowing these doors, one has to then come up with their corresponding antidotes. If not knowing its cause, get to know it. If the force of affliction is the cause, get to work on it, particularly working from the strongest afflictions. And then when it is lack of conscientiousness, right, one has to then build it. Conscientiousness is so important. I kind of personally see conscientiousness when we speak of mindfulness, introspective awareness, and conscientiousness. Sometimes people call it heedfulness, carefulness, whatever it is. That is the last executing moment when you have to pull it up. You may be mindful that yes, this is happening. You may be introspectively aware, yes, I need to do this. But then eventually when it comes to executing it, delivering it, if you slip, that's when one has, let down on the conscientiousness. So all 3 would play a very important role. But then at the very tip of the execution, it's the conscientiousness. So that's something to be worked on. So identifying them differently, separately, help us in working on them separately. And then the last one is out of disregard. This is so important. When we disregard our precept, knowingly, intentionally disregard it, then even the most minor precepts, which may be not naturally negative, would become negative and would become grave negativity. So, on top of breaching the precept, if we do that out of disregard, even if one knows that that's not what one wants to do, that Buddha has, that one has the precept like that, one disregards it. That sense of disregard, coupled with the incurrence of the negativity, makes that negativity, that breach of the precept, negative. Not just negative, but even a grave negative. When I say negative, breach of precepts is not necessarily negative or non-virtuous. But when coupled with disrespect, it can become that. So those so-called four identified as the doers of incurring breach of precepts has to be really very, very clear and has to be kind of really sorted out clearly and then applied to one's life. Venerable Tarpa, did you raise a hand? Okay.
In that list of four, I've often heard that third one is carelessness. Do you think that works?
Yeah, but that is too
gross?
Too wide and too broad, I think. And if I may call, too cheap. It doesn't seem to really bring it. So I'm using the term conscientiousness, heedfulness, but making sure that I also bring in what I meant by that. Because we have to kind of deal with an existing term and it may or may not capture the whole thing. And that part is something to be aware of in one's Dharma practice. When we are using English terms, we have to be very careful what we are using this for in the original context, how it then changes in the common context. I'll give you an example. When we speak of consideration for others, it's a very broad term, being considerate of others. Right? That could include being kind, compassionate, empathetic, all of those. But what we're using this in particular context is very different. It is a sense of restraint against negativity by considering how it might affect others. Specifically a restraint against negativity by considering how it will affect others. Whereas integrity, the so-called integrity, is the same restraint against negativity, but by reason of how that would be unbecoming of me, how that would be so unbecoming of me, having taken this vow, or aspiring, being someone who aspires to attain Buddhahood, how it would be so unbecoming under my dignity to do this. So restraining against the negativity, but by reason of how it would be unbecoming of oneself, by reasoning of self, by reasoning of others. So likewise, these terms when we use, we have to be wary about, be open in exploring what the original term might stand for, how that translates into English and how that then brings in other aspects, so that one will be able to deal with them. Because we have no choice but to use available terms. If we were to totally coin a word and say, nobody will understand it. Pardon?
We can just use Tibetan then.
Yeah, we could use Tibetan, but when we use Tibetan, it will not be accessible to others. But yes, that's one way of going back and forth like that. Okay, I think I have used up my time. Right? It's already time now. So, you can discuss you can raise questions you have related to this, or otherwise, as the discussion leader has planned for it, you could discuss things like that in the discussion time. No questions to me. Please don't. Do you have one? Okay, let's consider this just one and the last for this session.
So in the beginning you talked about motivation for individual liberation. And in context of the Mahayana path, I'm sometimes confused about how I should relate to motivation for individual liberation specifically.
Oh, yeah.
So sometimes we have in recitations like spit on those who are motivated for individual liberation, and then on the other hand I also understand that the sutra path is the Sutrayana path, or Theravada, is kind of the basis for Mahayana. So from that perspective it would mean that this is kind of a necessary step and the basis for then the additional bodhicitta motivation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would be grateful for some.
One thing about that statement, spit on. I think if you look carefully, it is spitting on that attitude, not the person. That's one thing. And this is a Mahayana text, a bodhisattva. For a bodhisattva to fall into the trap of self-centeredness, even if that is self-centeredness in focusing on one's liberation, would be a big hurdle on their way to becoming fully awakened. So that's why those words are there. So it is from a bodhisattva perspective. Not that they do not value arhats, but for them, that's not the choice. So from their perspective, that's something to be really spit on, the attitude. That's one thing. Now another thing is bodhisattvas do work for liberation. This is very important. They work for liberation, not just work for liberation, they work for it very much more stronger than the arhats. But not for themselves. As a way, as a step that they cannot bypass for attaining full awakening, for the sake of other sentient beings. So they not only aspire to attain liberation, but even strongly so, stronger than the arhats. They have even more sense of urgency in this, achieving it, but with not the slightest tinge of any self-interest in it. Only for the sake of ascension, because that's the way by which, that's something that they cannot bypass to achieve enlightenment. If there were to be a way to bypass it and not attain it and then still attain full awakening, they would have chosen that. There is no way. They would definitely want to. And they'd have even a stronger urge for that. But not for any slight reason, any self-interest is interested in it.
Can I clarify something?
Yes.
So then it is not, because sometimes, or when we also had the two Theravadan monks here, it was mentioned that the Mahayana is not different from the Theravadan tradition, but it builds on it. So, but in this context, then it would be a little bit more, because, well, if it builds on this, it would mean to me that that might be kind of the first step on the path. And then based on this and based on this renunciation, you then cultivate bodhicitta. But you still, as an individual, go through the phase of having the motivation for individual liberation. Or is this something you bypass completely on, like in the individual path?
Not at all. That part you cannot bypass at all. One has to first get to this sense of where I am in a mess. I am in a mess, and thus I need to get out of it. They have to begin with the renunciation. They do not start out with bodhicitta. But some who may be exposed to bodhicitta practice may have a long-term vision, long-term aim at liberation. But first and foremost, they have to be seriously working on their own renunciation. Otherwise, there's no way they could develop bodhicitta. That has to be very clear. So it's not something that they can bypass at all. In a way, they have to be Shravakas, if you will, or they have to be what we call, not quite Shravaka, but they have to be someone who aspires for Buddhahood. We call that a common path with Shravaka. They have to go through a common path with Shravaka. Only then they can move on to bodhicitta, bodhisattva level. So it is built on it. Unless one has that strong urge, there is no way one could develop genuine compassion to others. It will be almost like, I do not want to get out of this, but may all of you get out of this. That's almost like that. I do not want to get out of this. I like it. It is not a kind of emphasis. But let all of them get out of it. For what reason? There will be no grounding at all. So that's why it's built on it. Okay. Yeah.